Hey, everybody, welcome into an emergency podcast edition of the Inside Nebraska podcast. I'm Zack Carpenter, publisher of Inside Nebraska. He's Greg Smith, the senior recruiting analyst for Inside Nebraska. And Greg, Nebraska lost a big time commitment in their class of 2023. Malachi Coleman, the 4-star, borderline 5-star commitment in the class of 2023 out of Lincoln East, decommitted from the Huskers on Thursday morning, a little before 11 a.m. Just initial reaction and thoughts.
Even though we know that, this was something that was on the radar, it's still a wow moment when it happens, right? And I think that in part because what you said, Nebraska's highest rated recruit, it's the highest rated recruit to come out of Nebraska and out of Lincoln in quite some time. And so you want to keep those kids in the fold. And just on paper, that's the type of recruit that you need to have as a building block as Matt Rule gets this thing off the ground, right? Like he's entering a rebuild of Nebraska football, and you want to have higher rated recruits to be able to build that foundation, right? Then you add in like the component of him being from the state, and that you just don't get many of these kids that highly rated from the state. It becomes a real situation for Matt Rule going forward, where it's just tough. Like, and again, this is not unexpected either to like people that follow recruiting, because you knew how closely Malachi Coleman was tied in with Mickey Joseph. And so it's just difficult, but it was not a huge shock to the current staff either, the new staff, who have made several offers to wide receivers as they've been going along here and making offers really since this past weekend when Matt Rule was first announced. It's just still a stunning day for Nebraska football recruiting.
Yeah, like you say, it's not totally unexpected really at all. This recruitment was tied in to Malachi Coleman and his family's relationship with Mickey Joseph. It's one of the higher end, I guess. I don't know the way to phrase it, of a recruit tied to one specific assistant coach, or in this case, interim.
Yeah, it's hard to think of another example like that where Nebraska has had this highly rated of a kid tied so heavily with one assistant. Yeah, that's tough.
Yeah, so I think it was pretty evident that if Mickey Joseph isn't at Nebraska, that Malachi Coleman would also not be at Nebraska. And I mean, Mickey Joseph's future at Nebraska is still technically unknown, but I think the writing is pretty clearly on the wall, even if it's not fully official quite yet. But we don't expect Mickey Joseph to be on the Nebraska staff going forward. He was arrested on Wednesday, as everybody watching and listening to this knows, for domestic dispute. And even before then, I think things were trending toward him not being on the staff again. We can get into that another time, but just looking at this recruitment, this decommitment, I mean, we rightfully hyped it up when it did happen. We covered the Malachi Coleman recruitment and commitment for multiple over years.
I've been following this recruitment for a couple of years because it was one of the cooler recruitments to follow, because, and this is when you talk to people about like, hey, what are the cool moments of like doing this job? One of them is seeing a prospect that had been working hard but wasn't a big prospect work himself into a huge prospect, and seeing that evolution of that. Malachi is definitely that. A couple years ago, no one knew who he was. No one was really recruiting him. He continues to get bigger, faster, stronger, has a huge junior season at Lincoln East as part of that record-setting offense led by Noah Walters, and then really burst onto the scene with that and his 7-on-7 performances and stuff over the summer and going to different camps, and became a bona fide top 100, top 60 recruit in the country. And so to see that evolution and to follow that along, and all the options that he had, and have him then pick Nebraska was definitely worthy of the amount of coverage and attention that it got and is still getting. I did, though, speaking of all of that, I did notice, though, in the tweet that it said that he would continue to evaluate Nebraska. And I guess you've been around the block on this thing as well. how much stock do you put into that? Because I know that that's going to become kind of a question moving forward.
Yeah, I mean, I think Matt Rule and his staff, whoever he gets to fill in as the next receivers coach. I mean, the recruiting live period opens up tomorrow, Friday, December 2nd through
Yeah.
December 16th. So, I mean, I think it would behoove them to make a stop into see Malachi, whether it's the first day of the live period or soon after. I would imagine that he would be one of the first players that you would go to see, period, and one of the first in the state that you would go see, along with the commitments in the fold in the state. But it's interesting to evaluate that. I'm not the X's and O's guy. I'm not Steve Marek, our resident ball expert, to know how Malachi would potentially fit in with Matt Rule's system, his schemes, and Marcus Satterfield, the offensive coordinator schemes. And we don't even have a new receivers coach named yet, so we don't know that.
Right, right.
But all that being said, Malachi is a 6'5", 195 pounder. Was most likely going to be receiver at Nebraska, though the defensive end, edge rusher type was still kind of on the table. Either way, he's the number 1 ranked player in the state, number 58 overall player in the country, number 2 ranked athlete in the country. There's been talk of potentially moving him up into a five-star prospect. So you're going to want to get a guy with that reputation and those measurables, that potential, that skill set that Clint Cosgrove, the Rivals national recruiting analyst, who's been all over this recruitment from the jump for years. You're going to want to get a guy with that skill set and those measurables as a weapon in your schemes. So I think it would make a lot of sense to target him pretty much right out of the gate if you're the new staff.
Yeah, and when you talk about those measurables, match those up with what we know about Matt Rule's history of developing players. Now, we don't know who that wide receivers coach is going to be ultimately, but we can rest assured that that person will have a strong reputation, right? Like, I think that with the way that this staff has been getting put together, that person's going to have a strong reputation regardless of who it is. I feel confident standing on that and saying it now. And so if you think about it going forward, Malachi paired with a staff that has a reputation for development as someone who is a heck of a tools. He's got tools, right? But those need to be developed and brought out. Like, that's still an interesting fit, right? And so I'm not trying to like hype people up to think that, oh, he's coming back, whatever. We don't know right now. What if we are at 2 hours into since he, announced his decommitment, hence the emergency pod. So we'll see moving forward. I think it would be smart for both parties, for both Matt Rule and his staff, to reach out and try and see, if they can, build that relationship. And I think it would be smart on Coleman and his family to also listen. Part of the reason for that is it's twofold for me. One, the development history of Matt Rule. And two, I say this often about like in-state recruiting. You want to be very careful about kind of spurning the in-state school, right? Like you do, and that's not like you can't do it. But I think that if we're being completely honest, it's different if you treat the home state school badly on your way out. If you're going to leave, if you make the best decision for you and your family. And I'm not saying so far that they've treated Nebraska badly. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying it is a factor to be aware of. And one of the ways you can show good faith that you're not just throwing Nebraska away if you're Coleman and his family is to at least hear Matt Rule out. Like, you don't have to like definitely recommit, but I do think it's worth having a conversation. That would be the advice that I would give to anyone in this situation, because it can be a tricky thing moving forward. But based on the things that we know about everyone involved, I do think that they'll continue to have contact. It's just whether or not that fit is ultimately there, and the big missing piece of who is going to be that receivers coach.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost a goodwill gesture, if nothing else, to at least listen and hear the new staff out. And again, they'll be hitting the recruiting trail in earnest, very hard, starting Friday. Matt Rule made that clear that he wants to have his whole staff in place by the opening of the live period. to get out there. The couple data points. Nebraska now, Malachi was the highest ranked commit in the class of 2023 for Nebraska. And now with his decommitment, Nebraska's class is down to 14 commitments. They're ranked number 10 in the Big Ten and number 46 nationally in the Rivals recruiting rankings. And he's the third overall decommitment from this class. Ashley Williams Jr., edge player out of Louisiana. A little bit of a wild recruitment there, committed first week of July and decommitted July 31st. We're not even going to get into all the tentacles of that recruitment.
Yeah, that one was.
Yeah, Cameron Lenhart, another edge player out of Florida, decommitted September 18th. That Matt Rule actually re-offered Lenhart.
Very interesting.
Yeah, that's another one that we could get into for another minutes or so. But so 3 overall decommitments. That's where the class stands now. And still committed are receivers Omarion Miller, Barry Jackson, Jaden Doss. I think, is there another one? Off the top of my head, I'm not looking at.
No, it was those 3 plus Malachi. And those are guys to watch. Like, I don't think that's not a secret. It's the Doss one is maybe the most interesting because Doss was actually tied in very closely with Bill Bush, obviously, as well as Mickey Joseph, who would have been his position coach. But Bill Bush was his main guy. That Bill Bush and him had a really tight relationship. And then as far as Miller and Jackson, both wide receivers from the South, from Georgia and Louisiana, respectively, you can expect some serious questions about whether or not they're going to remain in the class too. Both guys, especially Miller, will have options as far as if he wants to be reached out to by other schools. Barry Jackson, after a really strong senior season, and those of you who have been following along here at Nebraska.rivals.com, inside Nebraska, that I went down there to Atlanta to see him play, and I could not have been more impressed with what I saw with him in person. And so if you're Matt Rule, you do want to keep all those guys in the fold, but it is going to be an uphill battle with those receivers, given how close they were to the position coaches that are expected to not remain in Lincoln.
Yeah, and then one last point real quick, Greg, before we get out of here, I wanted to kind of tee you up to talk about Jalen Lloyd, the recently offered receiver out of Omaha. And just, I don't think that you've talked about it on a video breakdown, but another receiver recently offered, and I know different skill set than Malachi, different receiver, but just what are your thoughts on him as Nebraska is targeting him a little more closely now?
Yeah, I like Jalen Lloyd a lot. I've seen him play several times and in different camps and all of that. When he did it was actually my very first weekend with Rivals. I went to a wide receivers camp that was hosted by former Nebraska wide receivers coach Keith Williams. And the Nebraska Elite 7-on-7 group. And Jalen Lloyd was at that camp. Keith Williams nicknamed him Ferrari because of all the speed that he was displaying on that field. We're talking about like he's one of the fastest players in the nation. Like I think he told me, and I wrote it up in the story, that he was like a 10-3 100-meter is his fastest 100 meters. So he's a very fast kid, which again fits the athletic profile that Matt Rule is known to look for, right? Like in him when he was at Baylor, in that group, that's part of that group is now at Texas Tech doing some of the same stuff. Speed is what they're after. But he's not just a track kid playing football. He's also tough. And so I really like him as a receiver. We can probably expect Nebraska to turn up the heat on him a little bit more. It's interesting when he got the offer from Nebraska. He was set to make his college decision that weekend, got sick and decided to push that back, got the offer from Nebraska, and is now considering taking an official visit. He told me that he probably will take an official visit in December to Nebraska. I like Jalen a lot. Plus that's a different in-state player that you can slide in. Like there's a lot of benefits there, but first and foremost, Jalen's a really good football player.
Yeah. I remember actually that I think that was like the first story that you wrote for.
Yeah, I think it was the very first story that I did. Yeah,
I remember when he was offered, I remember the name, and then the picture that you put up for the offer interview. I was like, oh, that rang true in my mind. Like, oh yeah, I remember that. That was his first story. But yeah, Jalen Lloyd was so excited about the Nebraska offer that he lost his voice. Right.
Right. That's just what we're gonna say.
Right. And again, one last point. Getting back to the Malachi Coleman news. The early signing period is December 21st through the 23rd. But correct me if I'm wrong, Malachi does not plan to enroll early. And I think he'll be signing in or potentially, I guess the potential is there for him to wait until the Wednesday or the February National Signing Day on a decision. Is that right?
Yeah, that he does not. Yes, he is not planning to be an early enrollee because he wanted to come back and run track. He wants to. He's a great track athlete as well. It's a great time for track in Nebraska high school, actually. On a side note, but yeah, he wanted to come back and do that. And so he's not early enrolling, and I would expect him to take it to February at this point, unless something drastic changes. That's going to be tough to see him signing this quickly.
Yeah, gonna be really hard for the new staff to pull him back in and get him to be a part of Nebraska, but sure they'll be trying. They have some time to make it happen as other schools go after Malachi Coleman. Again, decommitment on Thursday from Coleman, and we'll be covering. We already have covered his decommitment with analysis and stuff, and we'll have more on him and Nebraska's overall recruiting. Plenty more coaching hires, transfer portal news on Nebraska.rivals.com and the Inside Nebraska YouTube channel. Make sure to like and subscribe to this page. Get these videos dropped right in your feed. Going forward, busy month ahead for Nebraska and on the recruiting trail and on the team. So for Greg Smith, I'm Zack Carpenter, and we will catch you guys again next time.